Hey everyone, Tyler Whitkin, lead community manager in the Austin, Texas studio, and I am joined by director of Persistent Universe, Tony Zurovec. Tony, how are you doing?
Good.
Awesome. Now, we concluded 2017 with releasing Star Citizen Alpha 3.0 to the live servers, and there's a lot that goes on behind curtains to get something like that done. So let's talk a little bit about the run-up to 3.0.
Probably a bit more challenging than what we would have liked. We would have all liked to have finished it, a few months in advance and been able to, coast right up to the end of the year. In the end, it came down to, there was actually a lot of debate as to whether or not we should cut some of the critical foundational features from 3.0 and push them into 3.1. But we really wanted to ensure that we got the basic skeleton for what we're going to need for all of the evolutionary gameplay enhancements that we're going to deliver in all of the, the 3.x series, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3 on a quarterly basis next year. And so we really, despite the fact that it really pushed us right up to the very edge, we were determined to get all of the critical features, not just the big obvious ones like, the procedural planetary stuff and everything like that, but I'm talking about things like the dynamic shop prices. I'm talking about things like interdiction, which is really necessary for things like cargo transport to have any sort of difficulty associated with them. You had to have that functionality within the game. And the fact that we got that in there and we were able to work through most of the big complex issues puts us into a very good position going forward, such that now most of the uncertainty, most of the research and development, most of the more serious challenge of getting these pieces of completely new technology integrated and functional within the game and talking to the other systems, out of the way, it should make all of these 3.x iterations a lot more predictable. It doesn't mean that everything that we aim for, because we're always aiming fairly aggressively in terms of what we want to deliver, because we want to see this just like the community in the game as soon as possible. And so we always try to push ourselves, regardless of whether we think it's going to be difficult or easy to make it. We want to go ahead and slot it in there and try. And sometimes we go ahead and reveal those more aggressive dates to the community. I think that we're being a bit more conservative, certainly in our planning and stuff next year, and the whole concept of going date-based as opposed to feature-based is going to dramatically change, I think, everything next year. All of a sudden, we're not going to hold up the entire version for one or two features that aren't quite there. We'll push out what we actually have, which is going to make the game, each one of these iterations is basically going to push, what makes up the game significantly forward. And so we're going to be able to get the latest and greatest out to the community as quickly as possible. And then if something does slide from, say, 3.1 into 3.2, they'll see it a few months down the road.
Yeah, and the community is actually really excited about that.
Us too. I mean, it's painful from a development perspective to have so many things in there. And like I said, it's like for 3.0 was a bit of an anomaly, because we really wanted to get like I said earlier, the structural foundation into the game, and we didn't want to leave pieces out and then we deliver something and yet there's still big missing critical pieces of infrastructure that we were going to have to tackle on 3.1 or 3.2. And because they're big critical pieces of infrastructure, if they slide from 3.1, then all of a sudden it's not just one or two or things that might slip. You may have an entire branch of of what you're hoping to deliver to the community isn't possible without that actually being in there. There are a lot of knock-on effects from things like the dynamic pricing in terms of the economy, that if you don't have that piece of the puzzle working, all of that gets pushed. And so now that we've got the basic structure in, there's certainly the potential for little individual pieces, here and there to slide, from one 3.x release to another.
But it won't stop the content flow.
It won't stop the content flow, and the impact is likely to be much more localized than it would be if we were missing a really, really big piece of the plumbing.
No, absolutely. So you talked a little bit about some of the releasing 3.0 and how it was tough, let's say, at the end of December. What were some of the challenges you guys encountered?
Well, I mentioned a couple of them there. The dynamic prices were right up until literally the very end. We had testing, some rudimentary testing that was happening a few weeks before we went out the door, but we were probably within about 2 weeks of the timeline before it all finally started to click together. Same thing with the interdiction stuff, and you kind of saw the outcome of this, which is we were tweaking some of this stuff right up until until the very end, and we finally got it in. It worked. There were a few minor things which which we paid for with some late nights, right on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, etc., to where we had a very small number of people that just really wanted to make sure that what players were able to experience and enjoy over the holidays didn't have any really egregious problems. A few of us basically just put in the time to go ahead and push out some temporary patches to basically make those things function considerably better than where it was a few days earlier.
Yeah, it never ceases to amaze me. I mean, all the time I've been here, I've seen consistently people almost saying, like, begging, can I stay? Well, let's get this out the door. It's really a testament that we really want this just as much as our community does.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting because near the end you have everybody wants to put as good a face, everybody wants to make sure that what they're working on is going to be perceived in the best possible light by the community. But as a company, and you're trying to close so many things down, you really do have to be taking entire portions of the project and saying, okay, this is we can't risk tweaking any more of this because we may destabilize something, and we're basically doing these these release builds, and we're trying to get the number of of significant issues down to the bare minimum. And so a lot of this stuff near the end, you're looking at it, you see a problem, and you're saying, well, it's a problem, it's not very big, the impact's going to be fairly limited, this is what it's going to do to gameplay. And so you're weighing all of these and making the decision of whether or not you actually have to fix it for 3.0 or whether you can go ahead and push it till to where we'll deal with it till 3.1. On some of these things, you're able to just close something down such that you don't necessarily fix the problem entirely, but you're able to patch it such that with very little effort, so that it works well enough for 3.0, and that basically buys you time.
And with
to
the
deal
hard
with it later.
dates, with the quarterly releases, it's really going to help that because it's really going to help organize the entire process.
Yeah. The dates will change. The dates will change everything. Not least of which is 3.0. 3.0 is always going to be a gargantuan release. There's no doubt. That there was never any question about that. And so it's very difficult when you're talking about integrating that much new technology, and a lot of that technology hadn't yet been finalized, so there were still a lot of implementation issues, and certainly you saw some of the knock-on effects in terms of, well, once you get it all glued together, what's the performance like? Oh, the performance is not optimal. Okay, well, we've got a limited amount of time to basically make that run as well as it should. It's not that we don't see the issues. It's not that we don't want to fix the issues. It's just that by the time you actually finally get all these pieces interconnected and working, and you're able to test it, then time does start getting short. Obviously, on the performance side, 3.1, one of the primary focuses of 3.1 is going to be to deal with speeding the game up, basically finding the source of some of the biggest problems in terms of server and client frame rate, and bringing those up substantially to improve the player experience. The single biggest feature, I would say by far, is of course the whole procedural planetary thing. This dramatically changes the entire game because all of a sudden we've got such a larger play field to on which we can paint all of this content. In addition to that, what I personally like is the fact that the types of gameplay that you'll get in that environment, on that environment, is going to be significantly and dramatically different than what you're going to get when you're flying around in a spaceship. All of a sudden, when you're talking about things like first person activity down on a planet, you're talking about things like taking cover. You're talking about you're much more exposed. You can't take nearly as much damage as say your ship potentially could. You're talking about you may be dramatically outgunned, not because the other guy's got a bigger or fancier ship, but because he's got a ship or a buggy and you're on foot. So all of a sudden magnitude of the differential between what different players or a player and the NPCs could be bringing to a given encounter, it increases exponentially. And what that's going to do is open up a lot of interesting possibilities for the clever player to basically to take this and figure out to use their brain to basically figure out how best to exploit an opportunity, to turn it around to where they're at a disadvantage, but because they come up with a more clever strategy, they're able to overcome in a way that another player that's not as experienced wouldn't necessarily be able to do. And so there's going to be this whole aspect of getting to know more about the game, and as you start to learn more about how things work, of course you will be able to excel at whatever you're trying to do within the game. If you tailor this to something like mining, there's going to be, which is now, and I'm happy to say that we're now turning our attention to this in significant fashion, because we were going to try to get this out, 4.3.2, the initial iteration of mining, and resolve it to a level such that players are actually kind of like the cargo transport, to where you're actually able to go down on the surface, you're actually able to scout, find areas where there are worthwhile concentrations of valuable ore, the value of which will be determined by what the price is at a given trading post at that moment in time. Sometimes the price of a particular commodity may be higher, sometimes it may be lower, and therefore the justification for you investing time and money and effort and enduring risk to actually extract these natural resources from an area and basically cart it back and sell it, it'll ebb and flow along with the economy. And so you'll finally start to see some of this emergent gameplay that we've been talking about so long actually come to fruition.
Which is awesome. Now, a lot of folks noticed in the community that we had some bug fixes and changes come in over the holiday break while the team was supposedly out of office, which begs the question, how do those changes take place? Because sometimes fixes and changes require a patch, sometimes they don't. So how does that work?
Yeah, the reason why we were able to affect some dramatic changes to the game for a couple of specific issues was because those particular issues were controlled via these back-end services as opposed to the game per se. The game basically takes care of all of the I'd say the high fidelity simulation, but it gets a lot of information from these back-end services, and you're going to see that, like for example, in terms of shopping, the game server itself doesn't actually know what the price of something is. It doesn't know where certain commodities, which shops, should actually have them. It doesn't know what the quantity should be. It doesn't know what the relative demand is. It doesn't know about any of that stuff. That's all controlled via, this whole, back-end side.
Okay.
And so what the game does is it understands when it needs to request certain chunks of that information, and it knows how to display it to the players to allow them to make choices, and then it knows how to take the outcome of those choices and plug it back into the service infrastructure so that it can have the desired effect. And so when you're talking about things like what we were working on, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, there were things along the lines of the environmental mission scenarios, which are controlled via a probability volume service. And the actual problem that we were running into was that some of those environmental scenarios weren't being properly cleaned up, and so they were residing too long on the server. And so all we wound up effectively doing is basically tweaking the probabilities of some of those things so that we made them a little bit less likely to occur, tamped down the number of ships in some of the scenarios. And what that in essence did is it gave the cleanup functionality that was running on the server a little bit more time to clean things up before the next scenarios on average would be getting created. So it just evened out the demand load at any given time a little bit. And so the interesting part about this is that as we push more functionality of this sort, from the server back to these backend services, it makes the iteration much easier. All of a sudden, we don't need to basically do a big, gargantuan, build of the entire game, run it through QA, do a much more massive test. All of a sudden, we can be much more, focused and specific in terms of what we're testing. It's like, well, it's the same game version. We're just going to tweak the service, or we're just going to tweak the data that the service actually utilizes. And you'll see a lot more of this. We'll have, for 3.2, for example, there will be a commodity service. We'll have there's going to be a service beacon service. There's going to be, we'll be changing, fairly soon, so that we'll have the air traffic control system will go to a service. And so in general, it's just taking certain key, select pieces of functionality from the game and putting them into the back end where they logically belong. And there are a number of reasons for this. You get some nice benefits, like I'm talking about the ability to more rapidly iterate and tweak this stuff, but one of the big reasons why we have to do this is necessary because we're getting closer to the point where we're going to try to get this whole server mesh functionality going to where the game is not exclusively run on one individual server that knows everything about everything.
Right.
Where we're headed in the not too distant future is, essentially going to be, there's a solar system and there's hundreds and hundreds of different servers, and each one of those servers knows about the key points. They know where the sun is, they know where the planets are, they know where some major pieces are that they could actually see or that the player on them could interface to at any point. But in general, most of their attention will be focused upon just the little localized area where they're at. And this will give us all sorts of benefits in terms of performance. It'll give us all sorts of benefits in terms of a whole number of other things. And you can start to understand why you need this when you think about, so imagine you've got a server and it just knows about a few key elements of the solar system, but most of its knowledge is fairly local to the area that it represents. But now all of a sudden a player that's going to go from that server to the far end of the solar system, he needs to be able to query, for example, all of the probability volumes that lie across this enormous expanse. The problem is that server doesn't have knowledge of all of those probability volumes. And so what you really need is a higher level system that does have knowledge of those particular data structures to the level of fidelity that you need it. And like I said, it's the problems that we're usually concerned with on the back end are usually quite a bit different in concept from the ones that we're worried about over on the game side. The game side is really where, like I said, you take care of all the high fidelity simulation, all that type of stuff. The back end is usually concerned, I would say in general it's more macro concepts.
Making tweaks and stuff like that. Okay, cool. Now you keep mentioning probability volumes, and I've heard that term thrown around a lot. What is a probability volume?
A probability volume is really just an area of space that dictates what you could potentially see within it. And by that I mean, are there a lot of pirates in this area? Should you be seeing a lot of cargo transports going back and forth? From where should they be going? From where should they be coming and to where should they be going? Should they, if they're headed in one direction, should they already be loaded up? If they're going in the other direction, should they be empty? If they're going somewhere and they actually have cargo, what type of cargo should they have? And this is all dictated by these probability volumes. And the way the workflow, generally works is that the designers set up these so-called environmental mission scenarios. We refer to them as missions. They're not missions as you would normally think of in terms of, well, you have to explicitly accept something and there's some sort of definitive reward that you're going to get. When we say environmental mission scenarios, what we're really talking about is just stuff. It's just the world happening as you're driving by. And so the first step of this is that the designers create all of these environmental mission scenarios, and then for each one of those scenarios they go and they tag it in various ways to identify what type of content it contains. They can also associate various rules and requirements with each one of these scenarios, and these scenarios can now be linked to each one of these areas. And what we're able to do is basically say how the probability of running into this particular type of scenario, and these can be combined. You can have you can have an area that's tagged for pirates and it's tagged for freighters.
Does it make sense that you run into pirates in this area?
Yeah, and then you can logically combine them so that, if I, for example, you can combine these things explicitly and implicitly, and by that I mean, if you have pirates and you have freighters, then it's only natural that you would also see a lot of debris because some pirates have actually blown up freighters.
Yeah.
And if you have security, that's actually in that system, then sometimes, if you think about how big space is, the odds of you coming upon a freighter right as it's being assaulted by a pirate, is actually really, really low.
Not realistic. Yeah.
It's not. It's like the vast majority of the time you would cross the area of space where they were well before those two came into contact or well after, and that's not
Or
in
never be
general,
near each other at all.
and that's in general not that interesting. And so we kind of tilt, or we're able to control the likelihood of you seeing more or less of something so that the player sees a little bit more of the interesting stuff and not quite as much of the after effects, except insofar as we actually want that to establish the general atmosphere of a given area. In other words, if you're in a dangerous pirate area and you see lots of debris, that can actually be used to make that area to basically broadcast the fact that you're in a dangerous zone.
But promote salvaging profession.
Oh yeah. That's there's a whole discussion we could have about the salvaging.
We'll save that for another time. We'll see.
So in general, you're able to take these probability volumes, the designers right now, and they can create these regions of space, and they can link them to these environmental mission scenarios, which have been basically had tags and various other rules and such associated with them, so that we're able to instantiate them as appropriate based upon distance from the source point of these volumes, and really the the piece of the puzzle that we don't yet have operational, which we're going to be aiming to implement later this year, is going to be all of the systemic connections, so that what an area basically knows about is dictated by what's actually going on via just players and NPCs in general. In other words, right now the designers are having to do a little bit more hard coding of these volumes than what we're going to be doing in 6 or 9 months time. At that point, what will wind up happening is you'll see the macro economy will basically be providing inputs to the probability volumes, which will then be querying all the environmental mission scenarios to figure out what you should see at any given time and place.
Very cool. And so, why did we decide to go with this technology? Why probability volumes?
The big benefit to going this route is really one of optimization. Clock cycles in general on a server is a zero-sum game, and so we want to be able to put the vast majority of the clock cycles to work where there are actual players. But we also need to have these simulation aspects in terms of, well, if you've got a lot of pirates in an area and they're basically picking on shipping, well, then you would expect that the price of security goes up to a certain level. And if players aren't responding, or even if they are, there's also going to be NPCs that are responding. And so how should that gradual rise in additional security forces taper off the frequency of piracy within that sector? And so what the probability volumes give us in essence is really the ability to more effectively simulate a big, complicated world where a lot of things would theoretically be happening, but we're controlling it via dials and sliders, as opposed to having to explicitly instantiate individual pirate ships and physicalize them and actually have them do the whole flight control systems to basically be tracking other players, other NPCs, etc., to get this effect. We're able to control a lot of that stuff at a much more algorithmic level. And to the player, if we get this all right, they should see no difference. What you should see is basically you're going from point A to point B through all of these areas that dictate certain probabilities of certain things, and it varies like I said with distance, such that you may be going through a low probability pirate area, then it's high, then it's low.
For the player, it's
when you're going from planet to planet, there may be 20 different areas to where the likelihood of encounters kicks up, and then in between those areas, for whatever reason, maybe because there's more security forces, maybe because there's nothing of value in there, whatever the case may be, you're not likely to run into any encounters at all. And so really you can think of them as a type of optimization so that we're able to get all of the benefits of explicitly simulating, millions and millions and millions of NPC, characters within the game without actually having to create millions and millions of ships and actually run that fairly computationally expensive logic on the servers, which in the end would take away from how many clock cycles we could devote to the experience that immediately surrounds any particular player.
It's kind of like the LOD technology, but for gameplay encounters.
That's exactly it.
That's really cool. And so the last question I have for you is, let's take a look forward, specifically with probability volumes. What's next? I imagine we're going to iterate upon this technology.
Yeah, the next big step will be, like I mentioned, hooking this up to the back-end economy so that you start to get more systemic linkage of all of these different behavioral characteristics. Right now, for example, you have the price of items can basically they can rise and fall based upon inventory and stuff like that. But we don't have the macro system in place that says, oh well, once the price of titanium or once the quantity of titanium in this area reaches a certain point, then I really don't need any more titanium, regardless of what my inventory level is, until I've basically gotten a certain quantity of copper, because it's copper and titanium together that will be used to formulate ship hulls. And I need ship hulls because players are demanding lots of repair services, and they're demanding lots of repair services because there's lots of combat activity in this particular area. And so what you should see later this year will be more linkage of these probability volumes into this whole systemic economic back end, so that you start to get a lot more intelligent flow of prices and quantities and what NPCs and what types of scenarios you should see within in a given area according to these higher level rule sets.
Well, thanks, Tony. So as you can tell, getting 3.0 out the door was a complex and ambitious process. So let's take a moment and hear from some of the others on the team.